Welcome and thank you for joining us today for our 2018 webinar, Real and Not Real, The History of Racialization in the United States. My name is Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. Grantmakers in the Arts is a national association of public and private arts and culture funders. Our mission is to provide leadership and service that advances the use of philanthropic and governmental resources to support the growth of arts and culture. The United States has a long history of racism, discrimination, segregation, and cultural inequity. Since the 15th century, systems and structures were put in place which have perpetuated discriminatory practices. Now, in 2018, we see some of the same issues of discrimination rendering racialized outcomes. But why? And what does this have to do with arts philanthropy? Join Nayantara Sen, Manager of Cultural Strategies and Senior Trainer at Race Forward, Malcolm Shanks, Senior Trainer and Content Development Coordinator at Race Forward, and Eddie Torres, President and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts, as they provide an introduction to the social construction of race in the United States. This webinar will discuss the creation and perpetuation of the racial hierarchy, ideologies of whiteness, and how institutional strategies for diversity, inclusion, and equity often get conflated or confused. Nayantara Sen is an activist, network builder, oral historian, and social and racial justice educator and trainer. She is the Manager of Cultural Strategies and Senior Trainer at Race Forward, the Center for Racial Justice Innovation. At Race Forward, she produces curricula, facilitates racial justice workshops to support movement organizations and nonprofits, develops narrative and cultural strategies for racial equity, and organizes the arts sector nationally. Malcolm Shanks is the lead trainer in the network department. They co-facilitate Race Forward racial justice trainings. They also provide coaching and consulting to organizations and institutions that need support in developing practices that produce racially equitable outcomes and promote racial justice. Eddie Torres is President and CEO of Grantmakers in the Arts. He joined Grantmakers in the Arts in October 2017. He most recently served as Deputy Commissioner of Cultural Affairs for New York City. Torres served on the GIA Board of Directors from 2011 through 2016. Prior to joining the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, he was a program officer with the Rockefeller Foundation. We're glad to have them present on this webinar. Throughout the presentation, there will be 3 moments of interaction. And those moments, you will enter your responses into the chat on the left when prompted to do so. At the very end of the presentation, I will be joining to facilitate a Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome Nayantara, Malcolm, and Eddie. Nayantara, why don't you kick us off?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sherilyn, for that beautiful introduction, and welcome everybody. We're really delighted to be on this webinar with all of you in partnership with Race Forward and with GIA. We have a record 138 people signed in on the call right now, and I believe registered about 250, so we have a large number of people joining us. We wanted to actually start off by both testing the chat function and by doing a bit of a roll call. And some of you, I see, have read the instructions and are participating. So please do let us know that you're here by putting your name and your organization in the chat box. And as you're doing so, feel free to scroll through and take a look and see who else is on the call with you as well. Welcome, everybody. It's wonderful to have you on. It seems we have people from every time zone, certainly, and from many, many states. This is wonderful. Welcome, welcome. So as you're all plugging in your name and your information into the chat box, we will go ahead and share a little bit about who we are and what Race Forward is and what we do. And for that, I will kick it over to Malcolm. Malcolm, would you like to introduce yourself and Race Forward?
Sounds great. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Just a little bit about Race Forward and who we are. The Center for Racial Justice Innovation is Race Forward's subtitle name, and that is because that is simply what we invest most of our time in. Race Forward was founded in the early 1980s based on the idea that we can, in progressive movements, both talk about race explicitly, center it in our analysis and in our strategy, and also win through multiracial strategies and coalitions. So that has been the majority of Race Forward's work since that time. There are a couple of ways that we do that work at this point. Most recently, we excitingly joined with the Center for Social Inclusion, so we were able to broaden the strategies through which we do some of this cultural and policy change work. The ways that Race Forward now divides some of its work, there's the Transforming Institutions and Sectors Department, which are a bunch of really, really brilliant people, including Nayantara and some of the arts lab work. And that is mainly focused on transforming some key sectors in the United States nonprofit and foundation and progressive sector. Then there's research. They have some really brilliant questions on hand that they ask about labor, about employment, about discrimination, all through the lens of race. They have some really, really interesting reports that they've just released that I recommend you all look to on our website, raceforward.org. There's policy development. These are the folks who are really working with the grassroots on a consistent basis to make sure that that policymakers are taking their needs and their wants into account, and also switching the sort of power dynamics that can be oftentimes held in the policies that impact our communities, and specifically communities of color. Narrative shift are the folks who are concentrating a lot on the messaging and culture of politics and current events, and shifting that so that we can always be race explicit, but also be mindful of impacts on communities of color in the way that media depicts us and talks about our stories, and also who is telling those stories. And finally, there's movement and capacity building, which is what Nayantara and I form a part of. And we simply do the organizing and training to build capacity among organizations to help them work more explicitly and strategically towards racial equity in the work that they're already doing. Some of our projects include Color Lines. I don't know how many people here have been to colorlines.com. I really recommend that you go there immediately. Color Lines is one of the only national publications and the only daily publication that focuses on politics, current events, and arts and culture, all through a race-explicit lens. There's also our biennial conference, Facing Race, which is the largest gathering of racial justice organizers, advocates, and activists in the United States. That will be happening this November 8th to 10th in Detroit. And then the last thing I want to lift up is the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, which is a coalition and alliance of more than, I believe, 70 municipalities and states at this point that are getting together and really talking to each other and strategizing around what it means to govern through a race equity lens, and to govern with the goal of race equity centered in one's vision. And so that's really exciting work that's been happening that has been brought in through our fusion with the Center for Social Inclusion. So I think that's all the information I think we have to or need to present on Race Forward right now. So let's throw it back to you.
Thanks so much, Malcolm. I would actually love to also lift up another project that is relevant to the arts sector work that Malcolm and I work heavily on. It's the Racial Equity in the Arts Innovation Lab in New York City. This is an intensive 18-month program that pulls 50 to 60 arts organizations and arts educational institutions through a racial equity intensive program where they're actually examining organizational impacts and interventions within the arts sector. But we wanted to actually start off by hearing a little bit from all of you around challenges or practices and concerns that come up for you around racial equity. So we'll do a poll, and that's what you see on the screen here in front of you. You can go ahead and vote by clicking on any of the radio buttons on the left, and as you can see, responses auto-populate and are anonymous as well. So the first question we'd like to ask all of you, knowing that some of you have grantees and some of you on the call may not have grantees, but you can interpret this question as partners or constituents. So how many of your grantees or partners need help with racial equity frameworks and practices? One, some, many, almost all, or no vote. And the second question is, how would you rate your organization's current practices and comfort with implementing racial equity in your work with a scale of 1 through 5, with 5 being the highest? So please go ahead and take a second to vote. It seems like some of you have, but many of you have not yet. And you should be able to click and the votes will populate automatically and you'll be able to see everybody's well, the aggregate of everyone's responses. So what I see here for at least the first question is we have close to 35% of folks saying almost all of your grantees or partners need help with racial equity frameworks and practices, and close to 50, not percentage, sorry, 50 people saying that many of your grantees need help with racial equity frameworks and practices. And then for question 2, I'm seeing about 42.9%, 43% voting sort of in the middle of the scale, 27% voting around a 2, and then a smaller percentage saying there's actually, close to a 5 with a high degree of practice and comfort with implementation of racial equity. So thank you all for taking that quick poll. I'd love to actually say a few words about contextualizing your responses for the poll, as well as clarifying why we're here to have this particular conversation about the history and the construction of race and racism in the context of arts philanthropy. So many of you, I hope, are familiar with the sort of ongoing results of the research that the Helicon Collaborative has been doing around where has the money actually been going, and how is the philanthropic infrastructure around arts and culture been either producing or reproducing or increasing disparities in terms of racial disparities. And so one of the reasons we're here is because the data is proving to be increasingly stark, and not only stark in the maintenance of racial inequity in arts philanthropy, but actually an increase. So for those of you that are familiar, the data is saying actually that 2% of cultural organizations nationally receive 60% of philanthropic resources, and that's up 5 percentage points from the last decade. So in the last 10 years since the data has been available, the disparities have actually been increasing. And what that has meant concurrently is that of groups that are run by people of color, that actually equip communities of color with access to arts and culture and are deeply integrated within communities of color, only 4% of philanthropic dollars are going directly to communities of color. We also know the national arts sector is representative of many other disparities within sectors, including being racially exclusive, entrenched in diversity frameworks, and not actually reflecting the racial and cultural realities of people of color. Within the sector itself, racial equity work is siloed, it's segregated, and it's under-resourced. Oftentimes we talk about the language of having a tale of two sectors, really, where resources are flowing increasingly towards arts organizations and portions of the sector that are resourced by communities of color, or sorry, by white communities, and then increasingly seeing a depletion of resources for communities of color. Another reason is arts funders and arts organizations need to stop reproducing racial inequities externally as well as internally. One of the really dramatic reflections from the Helicon Collaborative's work, especially the recent article that they produced called Not Just Money, Where is the Money Going, is actually the realization that arts funders and arts organizations are talking increasingly and learning increasingly about diversity and equity and inclusion, And the awareness around disparities is increasing, but the actual disparities themselves are also increasing, and they're not being ameliorated at a fast enough rate. So that's one of the reasons we're here, to actually talk about what does it mean to actually bring a deep racial equity framework and lens into arts philanthropy for it to be successful. Um, there's right now a confluence of research, policy, and leadership and resources, and this is really an opportunity for us to get it right. Um, Race Forward really believes also that racial equity movement building has to include the arts sector, mainly because the arts sector is one major space where cultural norms and values are presented, translated, and reproduced. That our museums, our libraries, our performing arts venues are the spaces where culture is actually created and reified. And if those are spaces where norms around white supremacy culture, which we'll talk about shortly as well, are actually being reproduced, then movement work broadly and sectoral change broadly is really impeded. And of course, the last point here being that Grantmakers in the Arts is deeply committed to resourcing and building capacity and skills of grantmakers for racial equity. And so we're therefore also really proud and honored to be part of this collaboration with them. Malcolm, I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to take us through some outcomes and the agenda.
Absolutely. So the desired outcomes for today's webinar are first to review the history and construction of race in the United States, to take a deep dive into how we understand ourselves as having race or not having race at all, and then to clarify the importance of leading with a race-explicit lens, taking that context into account. Then we want to put that context into as a layer into this conversation about arts philanthropy work in the context of racial equity. And we also want to give you some baseline information on how to move forward with Grantmakers in the Arts workshops in your community. So the timing for that will be we've just spent about 15 minutes on our welcome and opening. I'm about to pass it back to Nayantara momentarily to step us off in the first part of the racial justice key concepts. We'll spend a little bit more time in part two. We'll spend about 10 minutes talking about race equity and arts philanthropy. And then we want to leave 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A so that you all can really get in some specific questions and answers before we hop off promptly at 3:30 Eastern. So I will toss it back to you, Nayantara, to kick us off.
Thanks, Malcolm. So we're going to actually jump directly into this conversation about race and why we lead with it when we talk about inequity and disparities with this cartoon or this image up on your screen. I'll give you all a couple of seconds just to glance through and read it and notice a few things about it. It's a 3-panel comic. You can see here that there's a person saying, well, I think all lives matter. We should care exactly equally about at all times about everything. And then in the third panel here, you see that there's a house burning, and the person who is insistent that all houses matter is actually dousing the house that is not on fire with water. So there's a couple of things I want to lift up here about this comic just while you're marinating on the image sequence itself. We use this comic to talk about why it's important to really center a race framework and to lead with race, because we think this image actually speaks to a few ways in which the conversation about racism currently is happening in the country. One is that, and you can also perhaps notice that some of this language is analogous to the ways that communities talk about all lives matter versus Black Lives Matter and so on. The binary there being a problem itself, but it also really pulls up this question of racism in this country is based on a pretty ardent denial of reality and a sort of persistent deflection or repudiation of responsibility. So in one portion of this comic, what it's actually suggesting is the people slash person who has the responsibility and the resources to actually put out the house that's burning is not only rejecting that reality, but is also not assigning resources to actually deal with the burning houses. So to make that sort of really race explicit, what we are trying to really clarify here is white communities and white people with power are frequently in places where they're deciding or adjudicating their reality as and really claiming that their reality is a race silent or a deracialized reality when that is untrue. The lives that we live are actually very racialized. And not only is that happening, they're also the ones who are controlling the resources that can prevent houses from burning. There's a bit of, you might actually see here in the third panel, putting water on a house that's not burning isn't quite sensical either. So this piece around really overemphasizing uh, an equality framework, as well as the sort of false equation around everything should be neutral because everything matters at the same time. At Race Forward, we called that language the language of universalism, which is that universally all things are the same. That approach and that framework is inconsistent with reality because universally all things are not the same. In fact, some houses are burning, some cities are burning, and some communities are on fire, compared with the false reality that's actually being presented here in this image. One of the other reasons that we really center a race framework is that if we know that disparities at their core are falling along racial fault lines, and we're not naming race, and we're not framing race and actually leading with a race lens, then it's going to be impossible to solve for a problem that we cannot name or explain. And this is true. I'm sure many of you have experienced this dynamic where there's actually a conversation that needs to happen about racism at its core, and it gets deflected or conflated with a range of other issues. In our sector, there's a lot of language around using coded language to actually be proxies or placeholders for race, like language around underserved communities, minorities, urban communities, and so on, that is actually what we call race silent. But not race explicit, and not being able to name it explicitly actually puts us at such a disadvantage because it not only allows us to escape the problem, but we're also not solving for the root causes of the disparities. So at Race Forward, we put the discussion of race and racism in the foreground of the debate. And one of the things that we say is we address racism explicitly, but not exclusively. And what that means is when there's a racial dimension to a problem, we name it very explicitly. We frame it explicitly, but it is not exclusive to any of the other dynamics or factors or isms that may also be at play. So we use a framework around race and this can be race and identities or race and issues, could be race and gender, race and immigration, race and sexuality, race and class, and so on. What you see here on the third bullet point on this slide is some examples of a race and framework that both lead with race and are not exclusive. So for instance, racial profiling is race and policing. Environmental racism is race and environment. Transit racism is, of course, race and transportation, transit, built environment. And racial redlining is race and zoning and government and policies and economic conditions and more. All of these frames, I should note that there's a lot of work that went into making these particular frames and ideas actually common language within our country. There was a time when racial profiling wasn't called racial profiling. It was colloquially called driving while black, and a lot of organizing and work went into making it into something that's recognizable. So we'd like to actually create a bit of space for you to do some journaling based on your own organization and the conditions of your work. What I will say here is there's two questions on the screen, and in a second here, another screen will pop up where you can type in your answer. Your answers are completely anonymous. I'll just repeat that again. Nobody can see your answers besides Malcolm, myself, and the few GIA folks on the webinar. You want to type your answer into the little field that is right underneath the question, the first question being, how does your organization contribute to a culture of silence around race? The second question being, how does your organization interrupt a culture of silence around race? If you feel compelled or interested in sharing your answers with other folks publicly on the webinar, you can type it, you can copy and paste your answer and type it into the chat function. But if you use the poll, nobody can see it besides us. So feel free to type as you see fit. And take a second just to reflect. Maybe reflect on the comic panel that you saw. There's a lot to dig through there, and there might be ways in which you notice your organization or your philanthropic outfit actually deflecting from the problem, not naming the problem. Yeah, feel free to write as you see fit. And in a second, Malcolm and I will pull out some just some broad reflections. I see here a couple of people saying that one of the ways the organization contributes to a culture of silence is not naming racism or race as an economic driver of inequity. Malcolm, do you see any other things that you'd like to lift up?
Yes, one of the things I'm seeing as a common theme that's coming up in terms of contributing to a culture of silence around race is subsuming race within sort of larger other sort of umbrella categories or movements. So things like democracy or human rights or social justice generally being mentioned, but when it comes to race specifically being talked about, that still can be uncomfortable. So it's clear that everywhere under the umbrella is still not necessarily thought about equally.
Yeah. I see a few responses around equity language being explicit in equity commitments and so on, but not race equity. Yes, thank you. Under the second question, how does your organization interrupt a culture of silence around race? I'm seeing a lot of things around intention and commitment around going through training, equipping boards with policies and with educational opportunities. I'm seeing a few things around taking an intersectional approach to really bring more voices of color, voices of people who are experiencing disparities, some things around stakeholder engagement, some caucusing. That's wonderful. It seems like folks are doing a lot of different kinds of things, and still there are also many internal and external barriers to contend with. So thank you all for just taking a few seconds to reflect on these two questions. We like these questions because they are actually perennial. You can ask yourself this question every week if you like, both of them, and continue to build a community of support around your staff and your board and your colleagues who can answer this question with you. And with that, I will turn it over to Malcolm. We are going to engage some historical content around the construction of race for a few minutes. Go ahead, Malcolm.
Thank you. So we mainly want to introduce this section because we often, at this point in like the history of the United States and in the history of the world, one of the phrases that we may hear a lot is that race is a social construct. We have gotten at least to the point where race no longer dictates in many people's minds, at least at the level of government, who people are on the inside, for example, even though government may still play a role and does still play a role in determining people's outcomes based on race. But when we hear the word social construct, we never really get to have a conversation about when it was constructed, how it was constructed, and what society actually constructed it, right? And so that's sort of what we're going to go into today, and thinking about racecraft and thinking about how we come to understand ourselves as having race at all. One of the main things that Race Forward says about race is that it is both real and not real. It both has very real impacts because it is refracted through a variety of different material and physical institutions that dictate how we live our lives and whether we get to live them how we want to. And it is not real in the sense that there is nothing biological or genetic that can be isolated about race. As a species, we are much more similar to one another than we are dissimilar. And in fact, there's more genetic diversity within what we consider racial categories than between what we consider racial categories to be. And so then we have to consider why exactly the human species was in fact categorized into different races. And one of the first points is that the racial hierarchy in the United States was set up for very specific political and economic reasons. But it was set up to preserve the idea of a white racial superiority that was maintained through purity. And in order to maintain that purity, there are several ways that the United States, as in first the British colonial government, and then the American colonial government, and then the U.S. state, which is also functions as a colonial government, continues to maintain racial hierarchy through racial division. I want to draw your attention, the image that you have here on your screen is of a postcard that was sent to homeowners in Northern Virginia in the early 1970s. And some people, when we show this during workshops, sometimes we get a gasp at 1970, right? And one of the main points here is that there is a very long duration to racism, and that it consistently both revamps itself and rehashes old themes that we might think would be outdated. And so in this way, we're seeing a lot of themes that we would consider to be from the maybe early 20th century resurfacing at the time where schools are desegregating. Some of the same ideas about the inherent superiority of whiteness and people who can claim to be white is resurfacing at a time where people are trying to argue against the desegregation of schools. And that was what this postcard was intended to advocate against in the neighborhood. We're seeing a binary being set up here, right, between the things that Europeans and people who are racialized as white at that point think that they or consider themselves to be bringing to the world, and everything that they consider the rest of the world to be holding them back with, right? So there's very much an idea that the development of capitalism, the development of industry, and the development and the rapid changing in the world economy due to colonialism and capitalism was due to the inherent superiority of white people, and any resistance to that was simply from not understanding the benefits of civilization and needing to become more intelligent and evolved in order to participate in that new civilization properly. And so we are seeing some of the words here give clues to that kind of assumption of both superiority and benevolence combined into one, right? And so then when we see the way that that translates into an idea of that needing to be protected, whiteness then coalesces into a scarce resource that is under threat from the rest of the world. And so in that way, we see here 10% of the world is white, that creative intelligence is in the white blood, which is a minority. We see that both whiteness is being created as a thing that can be named and identified, and also that they've already, at that point, decided that it can be measured and perceived and quantified in blood. And so in order to maintain the bloodline of purity, of superiority, and of whiteness, it is necessary to do so many things. There are several policy implications that are constitutive of the ways that we think about race in the United States. And so those are the ones that I want to zero in on today. Those are the overarching thoughts about how race and white racial hierarchy are constructed in the United States and globally. But I want to zoom in on a specific story, because this is not a complete history of race that we're about to give you. It is simply a snapshot into an interesting story that illuminates some significant dynamics and qualities of race as a social construct and as a racial hierarchy. And so one of those is concentrating on this heart in the middle, right? A necessary lens through which to view this story of how we come to understand and have race is through the lens of gender and reproduction. If we are talking about who is thought of as more responsible for maintaining the purity of the white race through things like chastity and maintaining proper social boundaries, it is overwhelmingly in the history of the United States white women who are white people who are given the burden of that. And that is one of the reasons that we are seeing a white woman depicted with what we can assume is a depiction of a black man here, because anxieties around race mixing and anxieties around sexual relationships between people of different races animated so many of the controlling policies that were used to control both the mobility, access, and social interactions of white women. And so that is an important part of this history of race. One of the other important things to mention here is the way that this papers over the reality of sexuality under racism and white supremacy, which is an extraordinary amount of sexual violence perpetrated against black and indigenous women by men who are white settlers. And that has a lot of implications for the way that we think and construct race. We have here a registration of birth and color from Virginia. One of the things to note here is the asterisk at the bottom, right? We're coming to decide as a nation, people are coming to decide who gets to count as white. But there are several contradictory kinds of things within that. It says here a white person is one with no trace whatever of blood of another race, except that with 1/16 of the blood of American Indian. And so what we see is that there is something called the one-drop rule, and the one-drop rule dictates that a white person, that if any of your ancestry can be traced to Africa or can be traced to a black person, then that means that you are counted as black by the United States government or by the state government, and therefore can be counted as property in the context of enslavement. We are seeing here that actually more and more black people are being created by this logic, because no matter how light-skinned you are, no matter how much of your ancestry is white, if there is a single black person in your family, you would still be counted as black. And this arises in many ways from the context of enslavement. But what I want to point out here is that it also provides a profit motive for sexual violence against black women on plantations. Because if property can, according to the United States government, only pass down, and the property status can only be passed down through the status of the mother, and the mother is in fact a person with no ability to consent to sexual activity from a master or an overseer or anyone in an oppressive and exploitative dynamic, then in fact more property is being created through the sexual violence against black women in United States history. And this is one of the animating logics of the one-drop rule, that more and more black people can be consistently created at any time because the labor force is consistently needed to recreate itself. In the same ways, we see an exception to this rule that is blood quantum. We saw on the registration that it said, except that person who's 1/16 mixed with the blood of an American Indian, right? And so in many ways, the logic of the racialization of indigenous people vis-a-vis the federal government is almost opposite and would definitely seem contradictory, because the way that blood quantum is set up, it measures blood based on membership in an indigenous nation that is not always correlated to race specifically. So within a couple of generations, it's very possible that one's children, one's grandchildren cannot be counted as indigenous according to the United States federal government or according to the state government. And in that way, there's a racial construct that is producing fewer and fewer people who can be counted as indigenous by the federal government. So we have one that is creating more and more black people, and another that is creating fewer and fewer indigenous people. And the one thing that unites those is the purpose. It's the protection and replication of property. That property is for the social, cultural, and political gain of white settlers, and specifically white upper-class settlers, and that they're doing that through the control over land, labor, and the capital of people of color. And so in many ways, we hear a lot that the way that we understand race is due to bigotry and misunderstanding and warfare. And while that is true, we also want to acknowledge the ways that it is set up as a system with a purpose in order to create and maintain very specific access to resources, opportunities, and privilege intergenerationally for white settlers who will then be protected from the consequences of that violent system. And the consequences of those constructs we see all around us today. And the only way that we can address these inequities is actually for us to be historically grounded, to be contextual, and to be political in our speech. And what that really means is political is just a fancy way of saying that we name the reality around us as we see it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But right now I want to pass it back to Nayantara.
Hi, Nayantara. Also check the mute on your headset as well as the mic button on the Adobe Connect interface.
Oh, sorry about that. Am I audible now?
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I had launched into some content here that I will repeat. Sorry for the audio issue. So I wanted to say that, Malcolm, thank you for taking us through a truncated and sort of historical snapshot, a bite-sized snapshot of a couple of policy and cultural implications around the racial construct. What Malcolm has just shared is one illustrated example of how the logic of the racial construct works. And the way that it works can often seem obfuscated or confusing because of the many, many dimensions of how racial hierarchies have perpetuated over time. But what we really want to reinforce is this point over and over, which is that race is actually a construct with purpose. And the purpose is both the creation of whiteness and the creation of white supremacy culture. And what we mean by that is a culture that assumes that things affiliated with whiteness or characteristics affiliated with whiteness are superior, and that the actual construct itself is made for the purposes of social, cultural, economic, and political gain of white communities or communities that have come to be racialized as white over time. So this question around how then do we address the inequities if our DEI efforts, so to speak, our diversity, equity, inclusion efforts, our efforts for intervening to address disparities in the arts and cultural sector are inadequately historicized, inadequately contextualized, do not have sufficient political teeth, and are also deracialized. So we're going to propose a couple of things here, and we'll share some examples and some additional content to make this clearer as well. But really what we want to start moving into is a conversation about, can DEI efforts be successful if they are not directly addressing the logic of racism, which is to create whiteness and as a superior construct. And I'm going to just propose this as a hypothesis, although hopefully you'll have encountered this in the world and will know this to be true in some iterations. Many times our efforts for diversity, equity, and inclusion do not produce racial justice because they are not fundamentally about building racial equity and about dismantling the construct of the racial hierarchy and contending with the legacy, history, and institutional impacts of the racial construct. So I want to actually move into some distinctions. One of the things that Race Forward always does when we talk about racial equity and about racial justice is we clarify what racial equity is not. And I have a long list of some principles and concepts here, and we're going to spend a bit of time distinguishing them. What I'd like to say before we jump into this slide actually is the reason for distinguishing racial equity from diversity, equality, inclusion, cultural competency, and multiculturalism is a strategic reason. It's a reason for actually understanding how the interventions and work that we engage in our field can have appropriate and adequate impact. It's not because we're concerned about just language or semantics. The conflation and the confusion between strategies and tactics around these issues is really the problem. So I'll start by sharing a few images, and we'll also share a fairly simple analogy, and I'd invite you all to extrapolate in your minds to your particular work context or your institutional context. I'll start with distinguishing equality and equity. I'd love to get just from in the chat function if you could drop in I'm curious if people have seen this image before, and I imagine many have, so feel free to just say yes in the chat box if you've seen this before. Many of you are saying yes, and I imagine this image is burned into your brains. Fairly simple distinction here. Equality is the framework of giving everybody an equal disbursement of resources or materials. It is not the function or the principle of equity because it is not essentially a differentiated and targeted treatment that gets people what they need in order to see over the institutional barrier, which in this case is the fence. So one qualifying distinction here is equality is the principle of sameness. Equity is the principle of differentiated treatment. There's many things about this image that you're seeing here, the one that many of you have seen before from Annie Casey Foundation. There were a few things that we didn't like about this image at Race Forward. One is that our training team, particularly when we deliver content, we were frustrated by how much easier it is to see the image and talk about green and orange and gray people rather than black and brown and white people. It's race implicit in this image. We also didn't like the fact that the image that, or the picture here that is supposed to indicate the person of color is essentially a shorter person. And, part of what that does is it indicates that there's something naturally diminutive or diminished or inferior about the person who cannot see over the institutional barrier of the fence. And while indeed many people of color are short, it is not because we are short that we cannot access the green field, so to speak. So what we actually did at Race Forward is asked our wonderful colleague, Erin Zipper, who's our graphic designer on staff, to remake the image for us. And what you see up on the screen in front of you is a redesigned version of the image that speaks to a differentiation around equality and equity, and also speaks specifically to the racial hierarchy in play. There's many things about the framework of equality that do not apply to the racial construct. One is that, I mean, when we talk about equality in this country, oftentimes it's equated with fairness. So being equal is being fair. And we dispute that because we say actually being equitable is being fair. And one of the things that you see here in the image is that the ground itself is on different levels. I should clarify here that the different levels of the ground is not because the three characters in the image are standing on a natural hill or a naturally occurring slope. What is actually missing perhaps from the image is perhaps like a plow or a hoe or some kind of instrument that's digging out the ground from underneath the community or the people who have come to be racialized as black, and actually dumping it underneath the ground of the communities that have come to be racialized as white, because it's actually an artificial system. The fact that the white person can see over the fence and is on higher ground is because of centuries of theft of land, labor, and capital from black and brown communities. And so the differentiation in land there, I think, speaks to both the disparity in the starting conditions, but also the historical legacy. You also see here that we asked our graphic designer to actually indicate the gradations in skin color and skin tone here. Part of this refers to certainly white, brown, and black communities, but also I think refers to many conditions of colorism, generally even within communities of color. This general idea of white supremacy culture, which says lighter skin is superior, or lightness and fairness is superior. Another distinction you see here in our image is that there's actually three fences. There's barbed wire in between the different people who are standing here, all of whom are the same size in this case. And one of the ways that we wanted to unpack this question of wiring or fencing between communities who are differently racialized is actually that within the racial hierarchy, jumping over barriers, or in other words, social mobility, is completely different than in other kinds of disparities or oppression. So for instance, in class inequality, there's a narrative around pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, or the myth of meritocracy, which says all you have to do to survive and succeed in this country is work really hard and pay your dues, so to speak. You cannot do that if you're a black person or a brown person who does not have a white privilege. You cannot just wake up one day and suddenly jump over the fence. So in many ways, the fencing actually speaks to the failure of the myth of meritocracy to adequately represent the reality of how entrenched the racial hierarchy is. Now, historically, racial passing has been possible in this country. So some communities have over time become racialized up the hierarchy, so to speak, in terms of either transforming into whiteness or being accommodated into whiteness. There's a really painful history around that of, over time, Italian communities coming to be understood as white, Irish communities coming to be understood as white, and then many both legal, cultural, and policy cases where Asian communities have actually contested for legal inclusion into the category of whiteness and been locked out of it. So the conditions of what actually constitutes whiteness changes with time, but the actual hierarchy has been fairly rigid. And what I want to propose here is that when we talk about doing racial equity work in the field or equity work in the field, that it's insufficient to do work around equality or diversity if we're not actually actively disrupting the hierarchy and the legacy of this work. So I want to give you another quick example that will distinguish some of the other principles. So we talked a bit about equality and equity here. I want to contextualize the principles of diversity, cultural competency, inclusion, and multiculturalism. So we'll start with an example of a dinner party. I will use myself as a hypothetical example. I've just moved to Oakland in the Bay Area, and
I have decided, hypothetically, to have a dinner party where I will invite my new neighbors. So I go ahead and I canvass the neighborhood, I knock on people's doors, I chat with a few folks, I invite them to dinner, and for my dinner, I am actually able to provide a menu or a meal based on the overlay of my resources and my skills and my context. So in other words, my resources are my budget, my skills are what I can cook and what I have capacity to produce. And my context is what I know how to cook and what my cultural conditions tell me I should serve for dinner. So let's say I come up with a menu of burgers and fries and some beer and some, blueberry pie. And when folks come to dinner, I realize quickly that I have a problem, which is that I actually have a fairly diverse community in my new neighborhood in Oakland. Folks have arrived that have a range of different vegetarians have arrived, people that are from my community, Hindu folks have arrived, can't eat the beef, vegans have arrived, some people have arrived with particular intolerances to gluten or lactose intolerance. Certainly people have arrived that can't drink the beer. There might actually have been a mother who arrived with her newborn baby who actually needs formula or breast milk. So the simple analogy here being that I have a diverse accumulation of people who cannot eat the meal. And the issue that I want to pull out for you as you're extrapolating to the conditions of your organization or to your work is that the strategy for diversity is insufficient in actually being a differentiated and targeted approach that meets people's needs. The appropriate strategy would have been to figure out what each person needed and then served them a meal that they could actually use to get nutritional fulfillment. Now I want to weave in this idea of inclusion and cultural competency and multiculturalism. In many, many cases, our organizations employ a diversity strategy and then overlay a inclusion strategy and actually consider that to be the same thing as doing racial equity. So in this dinner party, hypothetically, if I had said, oh no, I actually don't have the appropriate food to feed people, but I would like to make people feel included, I can engage strategies of qualitative participation and engagement that actually make people feel more welcome. In fact, I could even say to people, for those of you who are vegetarian who've come to my meal, I'm so sorry that you can't eat the food and are not going to get your needs met, but why don't you actually either potluck your food, or in other words, go ahead and take on the burden of describing the problem and naming the problem and then also addressing the problem and coming up with the solution. Or alternately, why don't you educate the rest of us about your particular needs? And the extrapolation here is that for racial equity, this happens far too frequently. Communities of color and people of color within arts organizations are often responsible for taking on additional labor as well as emotional labor to name the problem, frame the problem, actually push against institutional barriers, and then also come up with the solutions for fixing racist problems that the institution has created. So that's the question around inclusion and diversity and equality. To recap here quickly, equality is about sameness. Inclusion is about qualitative engagement and participation. Diversity is about quantitative representation. And multiculturalism or cultural competency in a way is really about celebrating differences, which you can do without actually meeting the need. So I'm really hopeful that some of these principles will percolate through your mind and through your institutions as you consider why aligning the strategy to the result that we need to see is critical. If you're using diversity strategies in your organization, you'll see diversifying as an impact. If you're using equality strategies, you'll see equality, but what you actually will need is racial justice strategies and racial equity strategies that are about differentiated treatment, that are specific to communities of color, that actually contend for the disruption of the racial hierarchy and the disruption of white supremacist cultural norms. That brings us to, I think, the last slide that I have to speak to here, our definition of racial justice. Race Forward's definition is the systematic fair treatment of people of all races that results in equitable opportunities and outcomes for everyone. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Malcolm and then to Eddie.
So when we're questioning why all of this is necessary to do and why we gathered ourselves in a webinar to actually go over this and to talk about it and share it, there are so many ways that this story and this structure of race and racism have been thoroughly entrenched in philanthropy and also entrenched using philanthropy as a tool. So the one thing that we know is that from the earlier review is that the hierarchy of race and white supremacy as a construct has enabled but was also created to accumulate wealth in the hands of white people. And that it is in fact that both that wealth that was concentrated, but also that wealth that was stolen from Black and Indigenous and people of color around the country and around the world, both through wages and enslavement and exploitation, but also military warfare. That it is actually that wealth that has been used to create many of the sort of seeds of the philanthropic sector that is then dispersed out to those communities that have been harmed. So in many ways, philanthropy comes from what seems to be a contradictory cycle of siphoning off a lot of wealth and power and money from impact from communities using warfare and other tools of violence, and then granting it back to them through the philanthropic sector. So it's a cycle that needs to be questioned in its racial implications.
Great. Thank you for that, Malcolm. Am I coming through okay? Is my audio all right?
It does. It sounds great.
Yeah, you sound.
Okay, great. So I wanted to thank Race Forward for all of this and just say how privileged we are at Grantmakers in the Arts to work with them. You know, I want to make the point that when we talk about racial inequity in arts philanthropy, we're not talking about racial bigotry as in I, John Doe, don't like that so-and-so. But in fact, we're talking about inheriting structures and practices and then failing to remediate them. You know, in arts philanthropy, we've copied the practices of high net worth individual donors without correcting for the fact that, you know, they actually had specific goals. You know, when arts philanthropy was created, this was a young country, oftentimes, you know, newly rich people in young cities, and they were looking to make theirs a world-class city, sort of modeled after a European city, which of course gave primacy to European cultural forms. They were also, you know, these newly rich people were parts of networks of other rich people, and they were able to establish leverage as a practice in a way that allowed them to rope in the resources of other rich individuals. Now, this basically has created a practice that rewards institutions in their moneyed networks instead of organizations in low-income communities. And when we have a country where obviously money is very racialized, we wind up with these very racialized outcomes. Now, this is a practice that remains enshrined in the giving practices of foundations and government agencies, and it's simply a practice that we've just adopted from the practices of high net worth individuals. Again, my point not being that these are necessarily bigots or any of these actors are necessarily bigots. We've simply adopted these strategies wholesale without remediating them for a different context. So when we see, you know, philanthropy move from the realm of the individual donor into the institution, and we see, you know, the sort of mid-20th century successful nonprofit model promoted by the Ford Foundation, let's say from 57 to 76, the arts grant gave primacy to the idea of leveraging foundation money with local money. Usually that's individual money. Sometimes this was a 3-to-1 match, a 4-to-1 match. This necessitated indicated that the organizations have high net worth individuals on their boards, social boards with social, corporate boards, social connections. And this created the unintended consequence of locking out organizations of color and communities of color. Now, this is a practice that became embedded in our field as a best practice and then was imported into the practice of the government. So when the National Endowment's Expansion Arts Program, when the Jazz Masters Program, when the National Endowment's Local Arts Agency Program were created, these were all financed at relatively marginal rates when you consider this compared to the larger giving portfolios. So you wound up with the funding of Alana communities, communities of color, and their cultural forms receiving marginal amounts of money. You also have language that reinforces this sense of marginality. So referring to organizations of color as culturally specific implies that Western Europe is the universe. Western Europe is the universal, and everything else is relatively marginal, which allows us to give at a marginal level without having to think about the racial implications of it. You know, likewise, the fetishizing of endowments. Now, in our capital workshops, we explain why a focus on endowments is a questionable idea across the board, but it's obviously especially unfair when so many organizations don't even have sufficient operating capital. And obviously in a country where, you know, African Americans, for example, are 13% of the population and hold under 3% of the nation's wealth, the practices like leverage, like formula funding, these punish the poor, and they result in the lack of resources and capacity in Alana organizations, and that we then use that lack of resources and capacity as evidence of why we shouldn't invest in those organizations. Now, this winds up with racialized outcomes, you know, so this is how, you know, to speak to Nayantara's point before, we wind up with 2% of the giving, 2% of organizations going to 60% of, receiving 60% of foundation giving. Now, obviously, we are encouraging our members to give to what we call Alana organizations, or organizations of color, depending upon your preferred nomenclature. But these are organizations whose primary mission and intention and practices are by, for, and about Alana artists, cultures, and communities. And when we say for, we're referring to the intention of the organization to perpetuate, promote, and present art that's representative of an Alana culture and people, and or that's given form by Alana artists. Now, we're not referring to a charity construct, like we're helping those underprivileged people over there. We're referring, in fact, to self-determination. Now, you know, we know this is a process, and we know we do better, but none of us have gotten it perfect. You know, we're replacing decades of what we thought were best practices and innovating new models. You know, replacing the leverage model and the formula funding model with capitalization models, capacity building models, are serving as gateway funders and other strategies. And you know, we know that this is a journey, and we feel this is a journey best traveled together, and that's why we host efforts like this webinar, like the Racial Equity and Arts Philanthropy workshops, because we know a community of practice, we need a community of practice when we're doing something new. So for those of you who are interested in hosting the Racial Equity and Arts Philanthropy workshop, by all means give me a call. We are a sufficiently small organization that I go ahead and answer my own email. And we also wanted to share these resources, and we'll continue to share resources like this. You will all be receiving a recording of this webinar so that you can refer to these whenever you like, and obviously please give us a call as we continue. I'd like to thank Nayantara and Malcolm, and I'd like to go ahead and open it up for questions.
Thank you, Nayantara, Malcolm, and Eddie. That was a great presentation, and it was great to learn more about the difference between bigotry and systemic racism, while also making the connection with the root causes of racial inequity in arts philanthropy. So as Eddie said, we'll now start with the Q&A. This is just a reminder to ask your questions in the rectangular box at the bottom of your screen. Please remember to address your questions to a specific presenter if necessary. So we'll go ahead and start off with one question for you, Malcolm. Going back to the culture of whiteness, the question is, what does white supremacy culture mean? And how does it relate to arts and culture?
That's a great question to start us off. So I think white supremacy culture can relate to two things, actually. I think firstly it relates to the culture of a society that normalizes a white supremacist hierarchy and a white supremacist society, right? So any society that has white supremacy as the norm, that's a whole bunch of normalizing violence, exploitation, and displacement that needs to be done. So I think that's the first culture, that's the first meaning of white supremacy culture that I think is important. The like denial and normalization of the suffering of people of color as like something that's necessary to the society that's being created. I think the second part of white supremacy culture is the idea that the ways that white, mostly middle class people present themselves in a professional context or any context are kind of the best ways to be. So the ways that people communicate across conflict, that people communicate joy, the volume at which they speak, the way people move their bodies, the way that they dress, all those things are culturally and socially constructed. And when you have a hierarchy where everything that white people do is structured as the best of whatever that can possibly be, how do I rephrase that so that it makes sense? That all things that are white are the best possible version of that thing, then it means that white supremacy culture becomes normalized in many organizations such that one has to, in fact, behave in a way that is either like a white person or palatable to a white person given one's placement inside the racial hierarchy. That those are the only two ways to be. And what I mean specifically in that is that for me, I'm a black person, right? So it would not only be that one would expect me to talk and act like a white person, but that if I don't do that, that they expect for me to assume the place of a black person within the normalized racial hierarchy, meaning at the bottom. So those are the two, that's how I would sort of define white supremacy culture.
Yeah, that was really helpful and very detailed. Thank you for that. We have another question that actually refers more to how one speaks about people who are not white. So the question is, why was the shortcut used to refer to black and brown people? What about Asians?
This is a wonderful question, and I'm happy to take that, and Malcolm, feel free, and Eddie as well, if you'd like to jump in. So I just want to check, are you all able to hear my voice successfully?
Yes.
Great, great.
Yes, absolutely. And this is a question that we actually get fairly frequently in both our trainings and our presentations. And so what I want to say is the description that we provided from a historical standpoint is actually quite truncated. What it does is it sort of depicts the racial hierarchy as the construction of whiteness in opposition to the construction of blackness. And I want to say that this is, in a sense, the hierarchy actually tries to fix what blackness is and fix what whiteness is in order to create that the actual hierarchy. And so you have a sense of where it comes from historically as well. This German physicist at one point had created the actual hierarchical scale of it was called the racial categorization system, with Caucasian at the top, Negroid at the bottom, and there was a range of 26 other categories that fluctuated with time, which were completely arbitrary, completely junk science, had no basis in reality at all. But was really peddled off as science, and then concurrently was peddled off as cultural. as well. So basically, all things affiliated with the Caucasian category became assigned a superior value based on this junk science construction. And in the U.S., what that has meant is the conversation about race has become very binary. It's become very black and white. And as communities of color who are not black and not white, so Latino, Latina folks, Asian, Asian American, API folks, both immigrant and second generation and third generation and so on, have come into the racial fold of this country, they've actually had to very painfully contest with the racial binary of blackness and whiteness. So what you all heard on the description was actually a fairly summative and truncated version of the racial hierarchy. It is absolutely true that within the racial hierarchy, every kind of racial category and every kind of racial community and cultural community experiences the impacts of the hierarchy and therefore racism differently and very specifically as well. And so I'll just speak on my own behalf as I'm a South Asian person of Indian descent and a first-generation immigrant. I've had to, in my experience in immigrating into the country, learn how to contend with both the binary of blackness and whiteness, which does not apply to me, which gives me racial privilege, and also have to fit into that binary because I cannot divest from it. That's what the hierarchy is set up to do. And so in terms of the racial history and the impacts of it, it lands on Asian and Latino, Latina folks and other folks as well, very, very differently and very specifically. And I would be remiss to also not say that immigration as a function of the state and also as legal policies have been certainly used to actually reify the racial hierarchy. So one quick example of that is when I was saying that racial passing is a reality in U.S. history. There were many times when South Asian people from my racial community actually contended to be understood as white, and their cases were rejected by the Supreme Court, actually. Not that whiteness is something that we wanted to necessarily aspire to, but whiteness brings with it the promise of health and safety and financial and educational resources and more. So just a quick note about that. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I've got a few other questions that are more focused on philanthropy. So this is more directed towards you, Eddie. So someone asks, are there any legal issues with a foundation specifically saying that we prioritize funding organizations for and led by people of color?
That's an interesting one. It kind of depends on the level you're talking about, whether you're talking federal, state, city, because different places have different laws. I mean, there's the short answer is usually not. With that said, I mean, San Francisco Arts Commission are actually a really interesting case study. Now, they're not a foundation, mind you. They're a government agency that, in an effort to resource racial equity, started an Alana explicit portfolio. And then in 2000, Proposition 209 was passed in the California Constitution. This was state law that basically made racially explicit priorities of public monies illegal. So what they did with that, I think, was actually very smart and inspiring and really admirable, which is they overhauled all of their grant-making strategy to basically make it easier for Alana organizations and artists to apply for support, and they targeted through their practice rather than making it a program, which I think is fantastic. Again, I would simply check in with sort of state law, usually not, though.
Great. Great, thank you. Going back to sort of the history of racialization and kind of thinking about that white supremacy culture and ideologies, we have a question about where that hierarchy came from. Was it a U.S. construct? Was it a European construct? The level of artificiality, is that more U.S., European? Can you talk more about that?
Certainly. Malcolm, would you like to take a stab at that first and I can fill in as needed, or would you like me to go first?
Absolutely, I can go first.
Go ahead.
I think the interesting thing is that the answer is that it was both.
Yeah.
When we're thinking about the history of the United States, what began as a European experiment on indigenous land continued and evolved into a European colonial project with an indefinite timeline, which is the United States government. And so I think when we take into account that reality, that it is in fact still people who are descended from Europe who maintain almost exclusive control over the political and social destiny of this indigenous land, then that continues to be a European colonial project. And so it's very difficult to separate them, historically speaking. What I will say is that in the context of the United States, in the context of the economy of the United States, which was dependent on commodities like cotton and rice, that the importation and deportation and sale of enslaved Africans was necessary to that in a way that, for example, on the continent of Europe, it would not have been. So there's a specific kind of relationship to blackness and indigeneity that that makes the racial hierarchy in the United States what it is, and that makes that different from the racial hierarchy in Europe. But they are both different iterations of a very similar European project, which is to orient the entire world economy into the hands of people of European descent.
And if I can contribute to that, Malcolm, this is Eddie. I'm sure that for you, Nayantara, this is content you know far better than I do. But I'm in the process of reading Stamped from the Beginning by Ibrahim X. Kendi, and he obviously makes the point that you're making, that racist ideas have largely been developed and sometimes simply selected and promulgated to justify self-serving policies, usually motivated by greed and the desire for free labor or low-cost labor, and that these ideas oftentimes, or almost always, followed the policies and practices rather than inspired the policies and practices, and that while some of these ideas were certainly developed in Europe very early in our history, they've often been cherry-picked just to justify our ability as an economy to have either free or to have low-cost labor.
Great, thank you. And Nayantara, did you want to add some more to that as well?
Yeah, just a quick qualifying point, actually, which I think is a trend line that I'm noticing across both philanthropy, nonprofit, social justice work, and more. A lot of times questions about, where does racism come from? Does it come from Europe? Does it come from U.S.? Does it come from, are all people sort of naturally biased in some way or the other? It does tend to sort of strategically lead down to this path of, let's look at implicit bias and how that functions as in human psychology and human brains, because there's an increasing understanding of brain science and neurology that tells us that human beings are naturally and inherently biased, because that's how our perceptions are accommodating, help us accommodate to our conditions. And I want to just make a quick distinction that race and racism is a particular artificial designed construct for a purpose that emerged out of ideology in Europe and then was perpetuated through colonialism into pretty much every continent through the colonial project in Europe. But that's different from bias and different from actually what we more colloquially understand to be xenophobia. And one really good resource that I lean on in distinguishing that understanding that people have a distrust of strangers is different than saying that there is a racial construct that is specifically categorizing people along lines of skin color and more. There's the resources by, it's a book by Vijay Prashad. It's called Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting, the Myth of Afro-Asian Cultural Purity. And it does a good job of distinguishing xenophobia and bias and racism.
Great. So we have another question. Some folks would like to know if you would still consider an Alana organization to be an Alana organization if their administrative staff is not majority Alana. And that could go for any three of you.
Yeah, this is an interesting, this is Eddie. This is an interesting one. One of the things that we try to differentiate when we differentiate between racial equity and diversity, for instance, or inclusion, is the issue of self-determination and the extent to which the organization was, founded by and of a community. And part of this consideration is also around the issue of the goals and intentions of the organization. That is to say, I just worry that the diversity construct becomes very easily, it degenerates into kind of a head counting, what is the pigment of this number, that number of the staff members. While I certainly can appreciate the complexity of those issues, when we talk about here at GIA, and I'd like to hear obviously Race Forward's perspective on it, when we talk about here at GIA, we're largely talking about the extent to which the community's voice is represented, the extent to which they are being served by the organization, their artists are being served by the organization, their community is being served by the organization. I say all that to say, for instance, my life and career is filled with white allies who are not Alana and who I regard as anti-racist. I would not dismiss any of them for not being Alana. With that said, this number, that number, I just worry that it gets into a reductive bean counting, which to my mind kind of smacks of a diversity discussion, which is not the same as a racial equity discussion.
I'd be happy to support, Eddie, what you shared and concur absolutely. I think one of the pieces that comes up in Race Forward's understanding around this question of, for administrative staff particularly, whether they're Alana or not, what we really see in the art sector is what I think Malcolm and I sort of colloquially call the snow-capped model, which is that leadership and executive leadership, management leadership, and decision makers at the higher levels of arts organizations and arts philanthropy are increasingly white, and administrative staff or support staff are increasingly actually women of color. So reversing that doesn't seem to be a solution, actually. Not just because, certainly for racial equity, we want to see more and more women and people of color in positions of power and leadership, but for racial justice, we actually make a distinction. I make a distinction between labor and leadership and power. In an arts organization, is the labor of people of color being valued appropriately and compensated adequately? are then they actually being promoted and advanced into positions of leadership. And then ultimately the end goal being that we actually are trying to aggregate power for Alana communities. And you can actually have leadership and have labor without having aggregated power or changing, Eddie, to the point of what you said earlier, without changing or addressing or remediating the cultural conditions of the systems that we've inherited. So the representational strategy only works if you're trying to solve a representational problem, but not if you're trying to solve an equity and a power differential problem.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to just direct one more question to the three of you before we wrap up. So someone asks, how do you advise engaging an organization's leadership if race is not seen as an issue within the organization?
That's a great question.
This is just a clarifying question. Not seen as an issue by whom?
Not seen as an issue by the leadership.
By the organization itself?
By the leadership of the organization.
I could start.
I'm sorry. All right.
Oh, no problem, Eddie. That's totally fine. I was just going to say I could start, and then both of you could jump in. The short version of what I want to say is that we highly encourage taking a organizing or a workplace advocacy stance within your organization. So we think about trying to move leadership, whether it's internally, externally, trying to move constituents, whoever is the audience that you're trying to move around a racial equity conversation. Firstly, it's impossible to do alone. We don't advise it. No racial equity work should happen without collaboration and partnership. And to do that, you might actually have to engage allies, organize within your own staff, figure out a collaborative and iterative and persistent strategy, and use the people that you actually have access to and resource and are resourced within your community. So I'll pause there and see if Malcolm, you want to jump in from an organizing perspective as well.
Yes, I think from an organizing perspective then, the strategy for engaging people who don't see something as an issue when almost everything that happens in the organization might be their responsibility, given that they are leadership, is simply to both do one of two things or both. One is to escalate the tactics and the context in which you bring that up, and to also broaden its relevance such that it eventually intersects with things that they do consider important, like staff retention, for example.
Great. Beautifully done. I wanted to just share a quick resource. There is a toolkit called Race Matters, How to Talk About Race, that has some good tips on how to initiate conversations with a race frame with resistant audiences.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Nayantara. And so, Eddie, did you have anything to add, or do you feel like everything was pretty much covered?
Please go ahead. What I would actually add to that would be three small points. One is, well, I mean, the larger one is to reiterate everything Nayantara and Malcolm said, which I agree with. There's also just the issue of failing forward. The fact of the matter is nobody is going to hit it out of the park the first time, and recognize that, like with exercise or meditation, there's no bad meditation effort. There's no bad exercise. So one, fail forward. Two, I've come to feel that the concept of safe space has become kind of meaningless because, the safety has now become kind of the province of the powerful. So safe space has come to mean I don't ever want to feel accused of anything or that my efforts are inadequate. We try to replace that concept with brave space, so that rather than concerning ourselves with the safety of the powerful, concerning ourselves with all of our collective bravery. With that said, when you are working for an organization where you are not the director, the safety that I do encourage people to consider is their own safety. I mean, you know, on one hand, safe space has, I think, degenerated into I, the boss, don't want to feel accused of anything, whereas, you know, I would encourage you to consider you, the employee, don't want to get fired. And so I want people to embrace racial equity. I don't want them to do that on the unemployment line. And then the other thing I would like people to consider is, you know, like Malcolm alluded to in terms of the broadening of the circle of relevance until it gets into the place where it matters to the leadership. You know, there's also looking at other fields besides arts and culture. For instance, you know, the environmental community has a real discussion going on right now about these issues. When we were talking about, you know, the disparities in cultural philanthropy, the disparities in environmental philanthropy are very, very similar. And so there are, and likewise, the kind of staff and leadership diversity issues are very, very similar. So there's also potentially points of resonance outside of the cultural community, and this is also true in terms of learning resources. So that also might be a place, one, for allies, and two, for lessons learned that can be shared.
Awesome. Thank you for that wrap-up, Eddie. So we're coming to the end of our session, but before we go, I want to thank Nayantara Sen, Malcolm Shanks, and Eddie Torres for presenting today. We enjoyed having you, and you leave us with a much deeper understanding of the history of racialization. Excuse me. Today's presentation has been recorded, and we'll be sending you a link to this file and the presentation slides in the next day or two, along with a brief survey and a few resources that you can refer to based on this conversation. Regarding the survey, your feedback is always important, and it helps us to design future webinars and workshops. Also, as you know, this is a preliminary webinar to the GIA Racial Equity Workshops that you can bring to your community. So we do invite you to reach out to Eddie Torres at eddie@giarts.org to learn more. If you'd like the opportunity to flip through the slides now, we have switched over the slide controls to you. The slides will be up for the next hour or two, and you can always reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley, if you have further questions. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great day.